When we imagine the immortality technology of the ancient Egyptians, I suspect that two images come to mind more immediately. The first, of course, are the vast pyramids that silently endure atop the Giza plateau. It's truly difficult to comprehend just how ancient those structures are, constructed between 2600 and 2500 BCE. I mean, we're closer in time to Cleopatra than she was in her lifetime to those most stately marvels. I suspect that the other image for the means by which the Egyptians achieved immortality was the famed Book of the Dead, or really better, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. That's their title for it, with its hundreds of spells and vivid descriptions of the heart weighed against the feather of cosmic justice, Ma'at. That technology only developed in Thebes around 1700 BCE, and perhaps its most famous example is the stunningly beautiful Papyrus of Ani, written around 1250 BCE, sometime during the reign of Ramses II, Ramses the Great. The mathematics there is startling. The Great Pyramids of Giza and the earliest editions of the Book of the Dead are separated by a gulf of a millennia, of 1,000 years. A similar gulf of time separates me, from the settlement of Vinland by Leif Erikson, the introduction of the astrolabe into Europe, and very nearly to the Battle of Hastings and 1066. Of course, we should not be surprised to learn that in that millennium, ancient Egyptian immortality technology evolved, and indeed a real revolution occurred in precisely that gap. Between the hieroglyphically barren pyramids of Giza and the bedecked and bespoke papyrus rolls of the Book of Coming Forth by Day came the very first written literature meant to provide immortality itself. These spells, rituals, and incantations were to be elaborately carved into the pyramids into the twilight of the Old Kingdom, and they provide us not only the keys of ancient Egyptian immortality, but also the very first depictions, the very first descriptions of that afterlife and the earliest sustained religious literature known to humankind. Known to scholars as the Pyramid Texts, this literature marks one of the greatest religious evolutions in all of human history. And if you're interested in magic, Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, or just the arcane in history, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my content on numerous topics in esotericism, including curated playlists. Also, if you want to support my work, this work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, freely accessible, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at Patreon with a one-time donation via PayPal, with the super thanks options you can find just below the video, or picking up some of our merch from the store tab on the channel. But now, let's turn to some of the earliest sustained religious literature in the entire world, and our first glimpses into the literature of the afterlife, and how at least some kings and queens were thought to have achieved celestial immortality. I'm Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Religion, in the broadest scope of that term, surely predates civilization. It probably predates humanity. And even the monumental architecture of sites like Göbekli Tepe may give us our first glimpse to some of the earliest artificial temples in the world, but these cultures left behind no written record of their agendas, and the best we might do with that is just to guess. We guess what the archaeological remains of their cults meant to them. We'll never know, probably. But the earliest sure religious documents emerged not from Egypt, actually, but over in lower Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq, among the Sumerians, in the famous Keshem of about 130 lines, which, along with the instructions of Shuruppak, represent the oldest literary documents in human history, dating to around 2600 BCE. However, just about 3 centuries later, the ancient Egyptians would produce one of the most sustained and enduring religious texts in all of history, lasting about 3,000 years. In fact, one that would survive more or less intact in various forms until the very end of pharaonic civilization itself. That immortality technology is known to scholars as the pyramid texts. Note that I refer to these texts, their rituals, and archaeological media as immortality technologies, and not tombs. At least when I'm being careful, I'll call them tombs later in the episode, and you can call me out for it. To my mind, it's just simply wrong-headed to denote all of this as funerary rituals, pyramids, to refer to the pyramids as simply monuments or tombs in any simple sense. Tombs, of course, are for storing the corpses of dead people. They're for storing dead people. But that's precisely the opposite of what these rituals and buildings, frankly, were meant to accomplish. They were means by which human beings, or, quasi-divine human beings, kings and queens, as well as some future rulers, could transition from once finite living state, that is, say, bounded by the body, the entropy of the physical body, to another living state, a different kind of being alive, this time fully immortal and dwelling with the gods in celestial immortality. Thus, terms like tomb, book of the dead, and funerary rituals actually do more to obscure what the inner logic and religious meaning, and frankly the religious understanding that these monuments and rites had for the actual historical ancient Egyptians. We should listen to them and not impose our categories upon those people. We can even see this in phrases the Egyptians used themselves. Again, they called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day and not the Book of the Dead. It was a book precisely for the immortal living, or in the case of the pyramid text, these are referred to as ach makers or achifiers, if you want a cool word to use at a cocktail party. Achifiers, that which made one into an ach, an effective immortal being. But to understand that concept, we need to go back and understand a bit more about some Egyptian conceptions of immortality. Frankly, scholars do not fully understand the religious logic and beliefs of those people that built the Great Pyramids at Egypt, though the best guesses are that the kings that dwelled within them were thought to ultimately dwell among the imperishable stars of the northern night sky, named by the Egyptians because, well, those stars in the northern part of the sky, above the solar ecliptic, they never set, and so that's a pretty keen candidate for immortality. However, by the composition of the pyramid text, a more specifically Osiris solar means of immortality was being theorized, and you can see that developed in the pyramid text. However, as we'll also see, this older stellar conception likely survives in both the ritual incantations, but even more explicitly in the architecture of the pyramids of even this later period. But as I'm sure many of you know, for the ancient Egyptians, the human being was composed of at least 3 distinct elements, maybe up to 5, but here 3 is what we're going to deal with. The physical body, the animating or vivifying force of the Ka, and the personality or the consciousness and memories of that person, the Ba. Of course, we're using the Egyptian aleph here, and it probably wasn't pronounced like that, and its pronunciation probably changed over time. Upon the death of the physical body, the impersonal Ka was released, but if that person wished to achieve personal immortality, it was necessary to release the trapped Ba. The Ba was still trapped within the physical body so that it could unite with the immortal Ka. The once immortal, though eternal animation force, and the once perishable personality force were then thought to be combined into a new entity known as an ach, literally an effective one. Thus, the pyramid texts were known, just as I mentioned a moment ago, as achifiers, that which made people into achs. Thus, this was just the start of the process, however. The immortal ach was part of a much more vast divine ecology, and we're going to circle back to that place of the ach with that divine ecology in just a moment. But the Pyramid of Unas, or what's left of it, frankly, isn't much to look at. It's found at the necropolis at Saqqara. Well, it is. It was the smallest pyramid in the region, and it was built for the 9th and final king of the 5th dynasty, Unas, who ruled sometime in the 24th century BCE. It's been heavily looted for its stone, and only a few of the outer casings actually still remain. It's pretty sadly dejected state of affairs. In fact, when you're on the Saqqara necropolis, you can easily just miss it as just a pile of rubble. However, it's not the pyramid that greatly concerns us in this story. It's what's beneath the ruined monument that does. Beneath roughly the apex of what used to be the pyramid lay Unas' unadorned and uninscribed sarcophagus. This is a reminder of the clean slate of the more ancient pyramids over there in Giza. However, Unas' tomb is a revolution in both Egyptian immortality technology, but also just religious literature generally. Inscribed on the walls and gables of his tomb, I told you I'd do it, are hundreds of spells, rituals, and incantations which provide us our first literary sustained depictions and descriptions of the afterlife, and, I suppose even more importantly, how one might go about achieving it, at least how an Egyptian monarch might achieve it. This is the Achification literature, known to scholars as the pyramid text. But I'm going to keep calling it Achification literature. These texts, first appearing again on the walls of the Temple of Unas, would further appear on a total of 11 Egyptian kings and queens' tombs from around 2300 BCE down to around 2100 BCE in various states of proliferation and elaboration. In fact, Unas' corpus would set the stage for all later texts, though the pyramid, for instance, of Pepi I would include about 3.5 times more ritual content as Unas' tomb, which comes out to be about 2,262 lines of text. However, for this episode, I'll be focusing mostly on the text of Unas, mostly because, well, they're the earliest, they're the most complete, they're the best understood, and they would become the template not only for the later pyramid text, but also for the eventual coffin texts and the eventual spells of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, our good friend, the Book of the Dead, which you probably have that E.A. Wallace Budge edition that you need to get rid of and get a more modern version of, just FYI. Thus, Unas' texts and rituals, which by no means exhaustive of the Achification literature, certainly represented a base canonical version of it for the ancient Egyptians. Now, it isn't clear when the text of the Achification literature themselves were first composed, though the language is pretty archaic when compared to contemporary secular inscriptions of that time, the time of Unas. Thus, it's likely, very likely, that the texts weren't composed in Unas' lifetime, or for him specifically for that matter, but likely date decades or even centuries prior. In fact, it seems that the inscriptions themselves were actually prepared from some kind of more, I don't know, generic exemplar text, probably prepared on papyrus. We think that because there are a few spots where a phrase like so-and-so, basically a name placeholder, is written, where King Unas' actual name should have been written. So, whoops. He just left his name out of an immortality inscription. At any rate, these texts themselves were first discovered around 1880 and are part of the ongoing archaeological, linguistic analysis, and our ever-expanding understanding of ancient Egyptian religious concepts have only deepened our understanding of these texts. In fact, Allen, who's written the best study of this entire literature in English, has published monograph-long analyses of just the grammar of each individual pyramid text. That shows you how difficult these texts can be, and many of them remain, frankly, quite obscure when compared to the more Middle Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day. I mean, we like that text better because it has pictures, because we're all 8 years old. And of course, Book of the Dead has that edgy, edge-core Evil Dead sensibility that no one can deny. We like the Book of the Dead for some reason. In short, what scholars have learned is that these texts are a sequence of rituals and incantations carefully placed in a specific sequence on the walls and gables of the tomb complexes, which allow for the Ba to be released from the physical body to join with the Ka to then become an immortal Ach, as one is wont to do, and exit the structure to dwell with the gods in the day barge around the solar ecliptic forever. This is accomplished by a set of initial rituals, probably at the time of inhumation. The ongoing power of the inscriptions themselves, they're carved into stone, both as enduring offerings to nourish the Ach, but also to guide the Ach to their celestial immortality after physical inhumation. The architecture of the structure itself, specifically, as we'll see how it mirrors both the movement of the life-giving solar transit, but also the revivification process of the god Osiris, with whom the mummified ruler is ritually identified with. But let's rewind a bit and let's unpack each of these in turn. The pyramid text can be roughly divided into two types. There are ritual spells and there are personal spells. Ritual spells are usually said on behalf of the person who would become an Akh, typically in the second person, addressing them, and usually these would be read out loud or pronounced by a lector priest acting as the elder son of the ruler. These spells were probably originally only recited orally once inhumation was taking place, but came to be engraved on the walls as a means of making them eternally effective, as if they were always in recitation, being carved on the walls there. Of these ritual spells, there are at least two types: offering and insignia rituals, and the, of course, resurrection or activation ritual. The offering and insignia rituals are associated with the northern wall and represent a sequence whereby, well, offerings are made. Ritual foods and libations, including lots of different kinds of beer and wine, by the way, are presented before a purification ritual, which uses salt water and incense as part of the opening of the mouth ritual, whereby the deceased, kind of deceased at this point, is able to partake in ritual nourishment. They won't be deceased for long. They're on their way to becoming an Akh. Following this, garments, dress, and regalia were all presented to a statue of the soon-to-be Akh, and the process was then moved over to the gods, after which certain vessels, often painted red, were smashed. The red color probably represents the evil god Seth, and smashing them was probably an apotreic. These ritual offerings were associated again with the Eye of Horus, thus restoration to wholeness, and would often rely on elaborate word plays in ancient Egyptian. The offerings would pun on the words related to the kind of spell being used. In later rituals, small figurines in various stages of food and beer production were also placed in the tombs, again, to make such rituals enduringly effective, as if you're always being made food and beer so your Akh can stay nourished. In fact, they even have little silos in there sometimes, with little silos full of little grain. They're kind of cute. Of course, the star of the show, the much longer resurrection or activation spell, is typically associated with the southern wall and involves the formal separation of the Ba from the physical body following all those ritual offerings and the opening of the mouth ritual. We have to get the Ba out of the physical mummy there. While missing in Unas' chamber, a further ritual on the western end of the burial chamber of Pepi I, remember he has a much more elaborate set of pyramid texts, sought to identify the mummified person with Osiris and thus commend them to the sky goddess Nut, although we'll see the same kind of ideas happening in Unas' tomb as well. Pepi's tomb also contains a fourth ritual addressed to his ritual statue on the south wall of his vestibule. Pepi the First text is just enormous. Other spells also occur on the eastern wall as well and alternate between ritual and personal text. These, of course, could be easily converted by changing the grammar from the first person to the second person, and they could even be swapped for gender. Again, there are some queens being buried here as well, though this was not terribly consistently done. The grammar is a bit of a mess for the queenly tombs. Women getting short shrift in history. Who knew? Their tombs are also much less elaborately carved. The burial chambers often just included the antechambers as well into one room. They weren't as nice. Other spells, for instance, on the western wall of Unas' burial chamber also include very specific protection spells written in quite obscure language, and these are mostly to protect the mummy from snakes and worms, because he's a mummy. Thus, to take Unas as an exemplar tomb, we have mummy protection spells and the burial chamber on the west gable, the offering ritual in the burial chamber and the passage of the north side. We have the personal responses rituals to those offerings, which are on the burial chamber and the east gable, the resurrection ritual, which is in the burial chamber and the passage, on the south side, that is. The spells for emerging from the duat, we'll come back to the duat in a moment, on the antechamber on the west gable. Spells for passing through the achet, we'll also come back to that. On the antechamber on the southwestern walls. The spells for achification on the antechamber of the east gable and wall. Spells for departing the achet, gotta get out of there, on the antechamber of the east-north walls, and spells for the rebirth process and eventually entering the sky Those are on the corridor on the west and south walls as you travel northward out of the pyramid. No, I'm not going to even try to summarize all these spells for you. You just need to go read them for yourself. Wait to the end. I'll have a book recommendation. And this would honestly be a great use for something like VR, where you could just imagine being in the position in Unas's tomb. We could put you in the sarcophagus. You would look over to the west and see the spells protecting your vulnerable mummy in the gable above you, again, over there to the west. You could hear the second person ritual spells being read to you, starting from the northern wall of the burial chamber, before starting your own personal spells in response as your Ach emerges into immortality, working your way through the ritual and personal spells as you move through the burial chamber and eventually become a fully activated Ach, united with Osiris, reborn with the sun as a child of Nut. Who doesn't want that? Finally arriving into the antechamber before being propelled into the northern sky through the vast ascending passage. This would be a great use of something, again, like a VR demo with like high-res imagery from Unas's tomb, or just frankly a historical recreation of it. You could have lector priests in there with you. You could even have an ancient Egyptian mode where we get scholars to like actually put it in ancient Egyptian and do transcriptions. You could even have a Pepi the First upgrade mode where you get 3 times more rituals with the non-shareware version. At any rate, this just needs to be like a VR thing. Isn't this like what meta is supposed to be? Or I don't know. I don't know anything about VR stuff. It kind of makes me queasy. All right, but why does any of this work? Why do these spells have any power? Why do they effectuate achification? Now, I've been mentioning Nut and Osiris along with terms like the Achet and the Duat. How do all of these work together so that we ancient Egyptian kings and queens, can achieve immortality? Well, the answer is that the Egyptians conceived the architecture of the tomb, the rituals performed therein, and those inscribed on the walls as uniting with and performing in microcosm the ritual of the rebirth of the life-giving sun through the reviving power of the god Osiris as son of the sky goddess Nut deep within the night. Microcosm, macrocosm. But how? How does it work? Well, this is going to require a little bit of Egyptian cosmology, which I imagine some of you know. The Egyptians imagined the world as a finite combination of land and water surrounded by an infinite ocean held at bay by a firmament known as Shu. The sky, or Nut, was the space beneath that dome of which the infinite ocean, or Nu, was, well, protected. And beneath her, of course, is Geb, the earth beneath. The divine sun transferred through the sky, through the year, in a dayboat in a 12-degree wide arc from east to west that they refer to as the Winding Canal. To the south of that canal is a region of sky known as the Sea of Reeds, with its unwearying stars and the mounds of Horus, Seth, and Osiris. North of that canal was the Field of Rest, or the Field of Offering, and its imperishable stars, the likely post-mortem realm in the earlier Egyptian mythology that I mentioned first. This is probably where people like Khufu were going when they were putting those giant tombs out there. I told you tombs, I did it again, on the Pyramids of Giza. As the sun passed into the night of the west, it was said to gestate in the womb of Nut, being born again at dawn between her thighs in the red east, sometimes referred to as the gory red east. However, in a parallel myth system, not a contradictory one, a parallel one, as the sun became Atum and it joined the night boat journey, it crossed into the regions into the darkness under the earth, the Duat and then the Achet. The Duat is the literal Egyptian underworld. It's beneath the world wherein dwells the very womb of Nut as Osiris, the mummy god, responsible for all rebirth from human revivification to the sprouting of seeds after the great yearly floods. In fact, Osiris began as an agricultural god. Once the sun passes through the 5th hour of the night, it became joined with Osiris and revived. It then exits the Duat into the Achet, the place of becoming effective. Thus, the sun is revived in the womb of Nut by Osiris before passing through the Achet and being reborn again between the thighs of Nut in the red of dawn, the bloody show, as some texts have it, of literal solar rebirth. I mean, I just love the image of the red dawn as literally the blood of her giving birth to the sun again. It's a very evocative image. The pyramid texts recreate this macrocosmic drama in microcosm, as above, so below. I mean, it's no wonder that Hermeticism would be born from these Egyptian myths. The mummy itself is identified with Osiris. In fact, in Unas's case, the early resurrection test, he's just referred to as Unas Osiris. He's literally identified with Osiris, with the overall tomb system being the womb of Nut. Thus, the spells slowly revivify and nourish the Ba, passing like the sun through the Duat antechamber, empowered by the three-chambered Serdab, whose exact function isn't clear, as the Achet, before being fully rendered as an Ach, before being powered through the birth canal in the form of the ascending corridor to the north. It's a birth canal. The mummy, the Ka, the Ba are all identified with Osiris and simultaneously undergoing in unison with the solar rebirth emerging forth by day. Emerging forth by day. That's why that book is called that in later generations, the book of coming forth by day. In this way, the rituals mirror and enact the daily cosmic rebirth of life itself. It's truly a glorious ritual, and of course, one that any person would want access to. And so it would be. Over time, these spells would be adapted and painted on coffins, at least at first for priests who could afford them, and then eventually for other members of the royal household, and then lower officials in the Pharaonic court before the so-called coffin text, and eventually the books of coming forth by day, in which anybody could have a fragment or even an entire roll of these texts note. And this had the effect of democratizing access to the afterlife, an afterlife accessible to anyone with a pure heart and the correct ritual observances. The pyramid texts are truly a decisive moment in both Egyptian religious literature, but also a true watershed moment in human religious history. Their concept of the soul would make it to Greece via historians like Herodotus and especially philosophers like Pythagoras. You know, he's known for triangles. Well, guess where he might have learned that? Anyway, from Pythagoras, it would become a central pillar, the idea of the soul and the metaphysics of folks like Plato. Indeed, this Egyptian influence is impossible to downplay for Western civilization, especially because no similar notion is really to be found among our other great spiritual influence. The ancient Israelites, who only had a very limited, very bleak concept of the afterlife, the shadowy, eternal twilight of Sheol. If you want to check out the concept of the Israelite afterlife, I've actually made a whole episode about it if you want to become really depressed about the concept of afterlife as if it was much of a life. If you want to dive in and really understand it, compare it to the more elaborated versions of the Egyptian concept of the Duat, which developed primarily in the New Kingdom on texts like the Book of Coming Forth by Day. While the Great Pyramids of Giza loom large in our minds and the vivid depictions of the afterlife in the Book of Coming Forth by Day ultimately inform kind of our visions of Judgment Day, it was truly the lesser-known pyramid text, or the Achvacation text, as I keep referring to them, that really represent a revolution, a real revolution in religious literature, and they are well worth your study. Without doubt, the best English edition is James P. Allen's Ancient Egyptian Pyramid text in the second edition. Really should get that second edition. It's worth it. Now, I'll admit, they are bewildering to read at first. But again, you can maybe do what I did. It's not VR, but I just printed out a diagram of every single tomb I was studying. And as I studied it, I just walked through in the tomb where these various parts were being said, step by step, trying to hear the second person rituals in my head, and even reading out loud the first person ones as I went, wall to wall, chamber to chamber, from inert mummy to eternal Ach. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and Ach, Wedya, and Seneb to you. And until next time, thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.